I was just a little girl when I first learned that not all families are filled with love. It wasn't something I knew from the start. When you're a child, you don't question the way things are. You just live in the moment, trusting that the people who are supposed to care for you do. But when I look back, I realize how wrong I was to believe that. My father. I don't think he ever really saw me as a daughter. To him, I was a commodity, another weight he had to carry in this world. We didn't have much growing up. My mother, who did her best, was always trying to make do, but she too had her struggles. My father's indifference was something I grew used to, but that doesn't mean it didn't hurt. He was cold, distant, never once telling me he loved me or even showing affection. It was as though I was invisible to him, nothing more than another mouth to feed. There was a certain emptiness in the air of our house, a kind of silence that would hang in the room like a cloud. My father's presence was more of a weight than a comfort. He never smiled. I don't remember a single moment where I felt safe or valued in his eyes. My mother? She tried. She always tried. But in a house where silence screamed louder than words, even she couldn't shield me from the truth for long. I remember the day my father sold my mother, though I was too young to fully understand what it meant. She left without a word, disappearing into the night like a ghost. I often wonder if she ever loved him, if she had any hope left at all. But one thing was certain, she couldn't stay. And neither could. It was a rainy evening when my father said, "Pack your things." He didn't look at me as he spoke, didn't even pause to see if I had hurt him. I obeyed, as I always did, gathering the few things I owned and stuffing them into an old, worn-out bag. It wasn't until later that I would understand just how much I had missed in that moment. I'll never forget the coldness of that night. The rain lashed against the windows, but inside, there was a chill far deeper than the weather could ever bring. My father was speaking to someone in the next room, his voice low and sharp. He sounded eager, like this was a moment he had been waiting for. "She's ready," I heard him say. "She's been trained. She'll do what's needed." At first, I didn't understand. I didn't know who he was talking to. But then the door creaked open, and a man I had never seen before stepped into the room. His face was hard, his eyes too intense, and the smell of smoke and cheap cologne filled the air. I froze, staring at the stranger as my father turned to me. "Come here," he said flatly. I walked toward him slowly, my stomach twisting. My father's cold gaze never wavered. He didn't speak to me kindly or offer any explanation. To him, I was nothing. Just a thing he had to handle. The man stepped closer, his eyes scanning me like I was a piece of merchandise. He looked me up and down, his gaze lingering too long. Then he nodded. "She'll do," he said in a voice that made my skin crawl. That's when it hit me. My father wasn't just making a deal about money. He was about to sell me, his own daughter. I wish I could say that I understood exactly what was happening, that I had the words to express the shock and betrayal I felt. But I was just a little girl, confused and terrified. I didn't know how to fight back or what to do. Something inside me broke, and I just ran. I didn't think, I didn't plan, I just ran out of that house and into the pouring rain. I heard my father yell after me, but I didn't stop. I didn't care anymore. I couldn't care. That night, I ran for miles. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. Away from the man who called himself my father. Away from the stranger who had come to take me. I wasn't an object. I wasn't a commodity to be traded, and I wasn't going to let anyone treat me like that. I can't remember how long I ran, or how many times I stumbled in the dark. My clothes were soaked, and my feet were raw from running, but I couldn't stop. Every step felt like a fight for my life. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know where to go, but I couldn't go back. Somehow, I found shelter in an old abandoned house. It wasn't much, just a roof and some old blankets on the floor, but it was enough. I curled up in the corner, shivering from the cold and from fear. I don't know how long I stayed there, hiding from the world that had rejected me. Days, maybe weeks. but during that time, something in me shifted. I realized that I was alone in this world, that I could only rely on myself. It was terrifying, but also liberating. For the first time in my life, I was in control. As the days passed, I found small ways to survive. I learned how to scrounge for food, how to keep my head down and avoid the wrong people. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. And somehow, that was enough to keep me going. Life after that night became a blur of survival. I was no longer the innocent little girl who had looked up to her father, hoping for his affection. That girl was gone, replaced by someone who knew only how to survive. I had to grow up fast. It wasn't easy. There were times when I'd lay awake, hungry, and scared, wondering if my father would come looking for me. But even as fear gnawed at my insides, I never once considered going back. That part of me, the trusting part, the part that had believed in family, had died the night he tried to sell me. I learned to keep my distance from people. Trusting anyone felt like a betrayal of everything I had gone through. I became tough, hardened by the coldness of the world. I didn't have time for pity or softness. There were nights when I would cry, but I didn't let anyone see it. I was ashamed of my vulnerability. I moved from place to place, staying in abandoned buildings, sleeping in alleys, and doing what I could to stay out of the eyes of the authorities. I didn't want to go to a foster home. I didn't want anyone to look at me like I was broken, like I was a victim. I was still a child, but the world had forced me to become something else. There were moments, though, when I found brief comfort. There was an old woman in the neighborhood who would give me scraps of food when she saw me hanging around. I never asked for help, but she seemed to know that I needed it. Her name was Mrs. Henderson. She was small and frail, with white hair that fell in loose curls around her face. She would smile at me, though it was a sad smile, like she understood something I hadn't yet fully grasped. She never asked me where I came from or why I was always alone. She just fed me when I needed it, and I learned to appreciate those small moments of kindness more than anything. Mrs. Henderson didn't know the full story of my life, but in her quiet way, she gave me something I hadn't known I needed: hope. The day I truly broke free from my past was a day I will never forget. It wasn't a grand escape, nor was it some dramatic confrontation with my father. It was something much quieter, much simpler, and yet, it was the most powerful decision I've ever made. It happened on a crisp autumn morning when I was about 15. I had been living in a rundown shelter for a few months by then, scraping by with odd jobs and surviving on what little I could find. The shelter wasn't much, but it was safe, and for once, I didn't feel like I was always on the edge of something terrible happening. I had a roof over my head, food in my stomach, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was starting to breathe again. But the moment I realized I could leave, truly leave, came when I received a letter. It was from a lawyer, someone I'd never heard of, and it said that my father had died. He had left behind some property, some money, and there was a small inheritance for me. At first, I didn't know what to do with that news. A part of me felt nothing. My father had abandoned me long ago, and even though he was dead, I had no attachment to him. He had never been a father to me, so why should I care that he was gone? But there was something else in that letter, a strange invitation to come and claim what was mine. I don't know why, but something inside me stirred. Maybe it was the chance to have something that was truly mine. Maybe it was the chance to confront the past that had shaped me in ways I couldn't yet understand. I packed my things, what little I had, and I left the shelter. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay where I had been. I had to move forward. In the years that followed, I struggled. I found a place to live, small and cramped, but it was my own. I worked odd jobs, trying to make enough to survive. I never stayed in one place too long. I didn't trust people. I didn't trust anyone. The idea of letting someone into my life, letting them know my history, terrified me. I had built walls around myself so thick that no one could break through. I fought against the loneliness. I fought against the pain. But there were days when it felt like the weight of my past was too much to bear. I would catch myself thinking about my father, about that day he tried to sell me, and the anger would rise in my chest. But I wasn't the same girl anymore. I had learned how to fight, how to survive. And slowly, over the years, I began to build a life for myself. I went back to school. I worked hard. I pushed myself further than I ever thought I could go. And even when I stumbled, even when I felt like giving up, I kept moving forward. It wasn't easy. Nothing was ever easy for me. But I wasn't the weak, frightened child I once was. I had become someone different, someone stronger. By the time I reached my 30s, I had a better grasp on who I was. I was no longer the girl who had been sold and abandoned. I wasn't the child who had run away in the rain. I had created my own identity, one that was mine and mine alone. I had a job I loved. I had friends who cared about me. And for the first time in my life, I was proud of who I had become. But the past, my past, was always there, lurking beneath the surface. It didn't define me anymore, but it was a part of me. And one day, I knew I would have to face it head-on. It was 20 years later, after I had built a life for myself, that I got a phone call. The voice on the other end was familiar, but I hadn't heard it in years. It was my father's lawyer. He told me that there were still loose ends to tie up regarding the inheritance. There was one more thing to be settled, something I needed to sign. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to face the past. But something in me, something deep down, told me it was time. I went back to the house where it all began, the house where I had spent my childhood. It hadn't changed much. It was still as cold and empty as it had always been. And there, in that place where my life had been shattered, I came face to face with the man who had tried to sell me. Stood in front of the house where it all began. The house that had once been a symbol of safety, a place where a child should feel loved, now felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in on me as I walked inside, the creaky floorboards beneath my feet a painful reminder of all the memories I had buried deep within me. The lawyer had arranged a meeting in the living room, a room that had once been filled with so much coldness. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with history. And there, sitting in an old chair by the window, was the man who had once been my father. His face was older now, wrinkled, and his eyes had lost the sharpness they once had. But even with time, there was something about him that made my blood boil. He looked at me with those same eyes that had once filled me with fear. The eyes that had sold me, abandoned me, and treated me like nothing more than a possession. His gaze was empty, devoid of the love I had always hoped for. But there was something else there now, something that almost looked like regret. "I didn't think you'd ever come back," he said, his voice hoarse. "I thought you'd be better off without me." I didn't know how to respond. The anger, the pain, the years of neglect and abandonment bubbled up inside me, threatening to explode. But instead of screaming at him, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I stayed silent. I walked to the window, gazing out at the overgrown yard. I could almost hear the echoes of my childhood in that place, the laughter of children, the promises of a better life. But it was all a lie. It was all empty. There was no coming back from the past. "I didn't want to come here," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "But I had to. I had to see you again. Not for you, but for me." He didn't speak for a long time, and when he finally did, it was as if the weight of his guilt had become too much to bear. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I was never a good father. I never knew how to be. I did things I shouldn't have, things I regret." His words hung in the air, but they didn't reach me. How could they? How could anything he said take away the years of pain, the years of feeling abandoned and unloved? The apology felt hollow, as though he was saying what he thought I needed to hear, not what I deserved. I turned to face him, my eyes cold. "Sorry doesn't change anything. Sorry doesn't bring back the years I lost. Sorry doesn't take away the fact that you sold me like I was nothing. You don't get to fix that with words." He looked at me, his face crumpling as though he was on the verge of tears. but I didn't care. Tears wouldn't change anything. Apologies wouldn't change anything. The damage had been done. I'm not here for your apology, I said, my voice firm. I'm here to tell you that I've survived. And I will continue to survive, with or without you. As I walked away from that house, I felt a strange sense of closure. It wasn't the kind of closure I had always imagined. I didn't leave with a feeling of peace or relief. But there was something freeing about facing my father, about looking him in the eye and telling him that I had moved on without him. The past would always be a part of me. It had shaped me, molded me into the person I was today. But I was no longer that little girl running in the rain, terrified and alone. I was stronger now, wiser. I had built a life for myself, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me. That day, I realized that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean excusing the things that had happened. Forgiveness was about releasing the hold the past had on me. It was about letting go of the anger, the bitterness, the pain. I had spent so many years holding on to the hurt, allowing it to define me. But now, I understood that I didn't have to carry it anymore. I didn't need his approval, his love, or his apology. I had found my own worth. In the years that followed, I worked on healing. It wasn't easy. There were times when the memories would surface, uninvited and painful. But I learned to live with them, to acknowledge them without letting them control me. I found my peace, not through the forgiveness of others, but through the forgiveness of myself. I forgave myself for allowing the past to shape me, for allowing my father's actions to define my worth. I forgave myself for thinking that I wasn't enough. I was enough. And I always had been.